One summer, the walls of Hogwarts grow too narrow for two polar opposites. When the ice of aristocratic disdain meets the fire of relentless logic, a storm is born, and there is no way out but to burn together. Relax and immerse yourself in a love story. The heavy, humid air of the Hogwarts library in early June felt less like a sanctuary of knowledge and more like a greenhouse for growing obsession. Hermione Granger was not a woman prone to flights of fancy, nor was she particularly fond of projects that lacked a clear academic outcome. Yet, as she sat behind a fortress of ancient runes texts, her quill wasn't tracing the curves of Elder Futhark. Instead, it was hovering over a piece of parchment that contained a list so dangerously ambitious it made the SPEW manifestos look like light bedtime reading. At the very top, underlined twice with a sharp, judgmental ink stroke, were the words, Subject, DM, Social Integration Through Traditional Commemoration. Beneath it, in smaller, more frantic script, Item 1, determine the specific threshold between appreciation and pure aristocratic disdain. Item 2, procure a cake that does not trigger a Malfoy family curse. Item 3, ensure he doesn't realize I'm doing this out of anything other than civic duty. Hermione bit the end of her quill, her gaze drifting toward the far end of the mahogany table. There he was, Draco Malfoy. The war had carved the boyish softness from his face, leaving behind a silhouette of sharp angles and a persistent, guarded exhaustion. He was hunched over a scroll, the silver light from a nearby enchanted window catching the pale white of his hair. He looked like a ghost trying to anchor himself back to the physical world through the sheer force of study. It was June 4th. Tomorrow, Draco Malfoy would turn 20. In the weeks leading up to this, Hermione had noticed a peculiar pattern. While the rest of the 8th years were reveling in the upcoming end of term, planning clandestine parties in the room of requirement, or flying aimlessly over the Quidditch pitch, Draco was retreating. He spoke less. He ate less. He seemed to be attempting a slow-motion vanishing act. You're staring again, Granger. It's becoming a statistical anomaly. The voice was cool, drawling, and hit her like a bucket of ice water. Hermione jerked her head down, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She felt the heat creeping up her neck, a traitorous flush she couldn't suppress. She quickly began to straighten her cuffs, tugging at the enchanted wool of her sweater, as if a stray thread were the most pressing issue in the wizarding world. I wasn't staring, Malfoy, she snapped, her voice an octave too high. I was contemplating the structural integrity of that bookshelf behind you. It's sagging. A shadow fell over her parchment. She didn't need to look up to know he had moved. The scent of him, expensive parchment, cold peppermint, and a sharp metallic tang of ozone reached her first. Draco leaned over the table, his knuckles whitening as he rested his weight on the wood. His long, slender fingers were mere inches from her list. Contemplating architecture? How noble of you, he murmured. His eyes, a storm cloud grey that always seemed to be searching for an exit, flicked down toward her notes. Hermione's hand flew out, slapping down over the parchment. The sound echoed in the quiet library like a gunshot. Private research, she hissed. Draco arched a single elegant eyebrow. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but a ghostly impression of one. Private research that involves my initials? I didn't know the ministry had commissioned a biography, Granger. I hope you're getting my good side. The left one is significantly more repentant." "Don't be absurd," she said, her fingers curling into the paper, wrinkling the edges. "It's a psychological study on the effects of isolation on post-war academic performance. And here, I thought I was just a student trying to pass potions without blowing up a cauldron," he retorted, his voice dropping an octave. He didn't pull away. Instead, he leaned closer until the space between them felt pressurized, like the air right before a lightning strike. She could see the fine texture of his skin, the slight tremor in his hand that he tried so hard to hide. The tension between them was a tangible thing, a magnetic friction that pulled her toward him, even as every logical instinct told her to run. For months, they had existed in this strange limbo, no longer enemies, but certainly not friends. There were two survivors haunting the same hallways, bound together by the silence of those who had seen too much. "You're doing that thing again," Draco whispered. "What thing?" "The thing where you try to solve me like a crossword puzzle. I'm not a riddle, Granger, and I don't need your whatever this is." He gestured vaguely at her hidden list. "I am perfectly content with my isolation. It's quiet. No one asks me to be anything other than a disappointment." Hermione felt a sudden, sharp pang in her chest. It wasn't pity. She knew he would loathe that. It was a visceral alignment with his loneliness. She knew what it was like to be the other, to be the one everyone expected to be perfect, or the one everyone expected to fail. "It's your birthday tomorrow," she said, the words tumbling out before she could censor them. The silence that followed was heavy, thick enough to drown in. Draco froze. The playful, sarcastic mask he'd been wearing didn't just slip, it shattered. For a split second, his eyes were wide, vulnerable, reflecting a hollow sort of dread. He looked like someone who had just been told his execution date had been moved up. "How do you know that?" he asked, his voice now dangerously thin. I have a memory for dates. It's a side effect of being thorough." Draco pulled back abruptly, the magnetic pull snapping. He straightened his robes, his expression hardening into a wall of ice. The warmth that had briefly flickered between them was extinguished, replaced by a biting cold. "Forget it," he said, gathering his books with jerky, uncoordinated movements. "Forget the date. Forget the list. If I see so much as a single enchanted streamer or a festive cupcake, I will personally ensure your civic duty ends in a trip to the hospital wing. Do you understand?" "I'm just trying to be." "Don't," he interrupted, his knuckles white around his wand. "Don't try to be anything to me, Granger. I'm not your project. I'm not a broken vase you can mending charm back together. Stay on your side of the library." He turned on his heel, his footsteps echoing with a hollow rhythmic thud as he disappeared into the shadows of the restricted section. Hermione sat frozen, her hand still pressed against the parchment. The library felt suddenly much colder, the summer heat outside mocked by the chill in the pit of her stomach. She looked down at her list. Item 1. Determine the threshold. She had found the threshold. It was a jagged, glass-strewn line, and she had just stepped right on it. But as she watched the spot where he'd vanished, her stubbornness, that fiery Gryffindor streak that refused to accept defeat, began to burn. He was lonely. He was terrified. And he was currently under the impression that he didn't deserve a single moment of joy. Hermione picked up her quill. She crossed out social integration. In its place, she wrote one word, her hand trembling slightly with a mixture of fear and a strange, exhilarating defiance. Connection. She wouldn't give him streamers. She wouldn't give him a public party. But she would not let him spend the first birthday of his adult life in the dark. As she began to pack her bags, her mind already racing with recipes for a cake that tasted like forgiveness and the logistics of sneaking into the Slytherin common room, she didn't notice the silver pocket watch Draco had left behind on the table. It was ticking steadily, marking the seconds until the 5th of June, its rhythm echoing the frantic, undecided beating of her own heart. The game had changed. It wasn't about the ministry or integration or lists anymore. It was about the way his eyes looked when he thought no one was watching. It was about the atmospheric pressure of his presence. Hermione Granger left the library, not with a plan for a party, but with the weight of a secret war. A war for the soul of the boy who had no one left to fight for him. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the forbidden forest in shades of bruised purple and gold, the first drop of rain hit the window pane, the precursor to a storm that neither of them was prepared for. The scent of damp stone and ancient dust always seemed more pronounced in the dungeons, but tonight it was overlaid with the sharp, acidic bite of a failed draught of peace. Hermione stood over her cauldron in the private potions lab, her hair frizzing into a wild halo from the steam. She wasn't supposed to be here. Technically, the labs were closed after curfew. But the restlessness in her bones had become a physical ache that only the rhythmic chopping of valerian roots could soothe. Across the room, bathed in the flickering emerald glow of a Lumos charm, sat Draco Malfoy. He hadn't spoken to her since the library incident 8 hours ago. He was meticulously cleaning a set of silver scales, his movements mechanical, his gaze fixed on the reflection of the moonlight through the high barred window. The fluxweed needs to be crushed, not sliced, Malfoy, Hermione said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence like a blunt blade. If you slice it, the oils oxidize too quickly. It ruins the clarity. Draco didn't look up. His knuckles remained white against the silver of the scales. I wasn't aware I was under your tutelage tonight, Granger. I thought this was a mutual agreement of silent brooding. It's not brooding, it's preparation, she countered, stepping closer. The atmospheric pressure between them shifted instantly. It was a familiar friction, a magnetic pull that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. You're preparing for a potions final you could pass in your sleep, and I'm preparing for tomorrow. Draco's hand stilled. The scraping of metal against metal ceased, leaving a vacuum of sound that felt louder than a scream. He finally looked at her, his grey eyes narrowed, searching her face for a hint of the mockery he expected. Finding none, his expression shifted into something more guarded, a bruised sort of skepticism. I told you to drop it, he whispered. I don't drop things, Draco. I'm a Gryffindor. We have a pathological need to be stubborn. She moved into his personal space, intentionally breaching the invisible barrier he spent his life maintaining. She reached for a vial of syrup of hellebore that sat near his elbow, her sleeve brushing against his wool jumper. The contact was brief, a mere tactile flicker, but it sent a jolt through her that felt like a localized lightning strike. Draco didn't pull away this time. He held his breath, his chest rising and falling in a shallow, uneven rhythm. "Why?" he asked, the word barely audible. "Why bother with someone who spent years making your life a misery? Is this some sort of penance? A way to prove you're morally superior to the Death Eater in the corner?" Hermione set the vial down with a sharp clack. She turned to face him fully, her heart hammering against her ribs. "You think everything is a calculation, don't you? Everything has to be about status or debt or blood. Has it ever occurred to you, in that incredibly analytical brain of yours, that I might just want you to be happy, even for an hour?" Draco let out a harsh, jagged laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "Happy? Happiness is for people who didn't spend their 17th year watching people die in their drawing room. For me, Granger, happiness is just a lack of pain, and you're making my head ache." Despite his words, he didn't move. In the dim, green-tinged light, his face looked porcelain, fragile enough to shatter if she spoke too loudly. Hermione saw the way his fingers drifted toward the inner sleeve of his left arm. A subconscious habit, a phantom itch of a brand that was fading but never truly gone. "It's not a project," she said softly, her voice losing its defensive edge. "And it's not about being superior. It's because you're the only person in this castle who looks at the stars the same way I do. Like they're a map to somewhere we're not allowed to go." The silence that followed was different. It wasn't the cold, empty silence of the library. It was thick, charged with the weight of things they weren't supposed to feel. Draco's gaze dropped to her mouth, then flicked back to her eyes. The tension was a living thing, a cord stretched to the point of snapping. He reached out, his hand hovering near her cheek. He didn't touch her, but she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. The air felt thin, ionized. "You have soot on your nose," he murmured, his voice losing its aristocratic bite and softening into something dangerously intimate. Hermione felt her breath hitch. "Do I?" "Yes, it's distracting." He finally closed the distance. His thumb brushed against the bridge of her nose, the skin of his hand surprisingly warm against hers. The touch was feather-light, yet it felt like a brand. Hermione's eyes fluttered shut for a fraction of a second, her internal monologue collapsing into a single frantic thought. "Don't pull away." But then, the door to the lab creaked open. The sound of heavy footsteps and the whistling of a caretaker echoed down the corridor. The warmth vanished. Draco jerked his hand back as if he'd been burned by a dark art. The mask of indifference slammed back into place so quickly it made her head spin. He stood up, knocking his chair back with a jarring thud. "Go back to your tower, Granger," he said, his voice now a frigid rasp, "before you get us both in trouble for your civic duty. I have nothing more to say to you." "Draco, wait!" "I said go." He turned his back to her, leaning over the stone basin of the sink, his shoulders hunched and shaking. The rejection was physical, a wall of ice that she couldn't climb. Hermione stood there for a moment, her fingers touching the spot on her nose where he had just been. Her skin felt electric, humming with a frequency she didn't recognize. She gathered her things in a daze. As she walked toward the door, she looked back one last time. Draco was still standing there, a lonely silver figure lost in the shadows of the dungeon. He looked utterly broken, a man drowning in a sea of his own making, refusing the only hand reaching out to save him. Back in the Gryffindor common room, the fire was dying down to embers. Hermione sat on the rug, staring into the orange glow. She pulled out her list, her hands trembling. Approach to repulsion. She had approached. He had repelled. It was a cycle as old as time, a defense mechanism built on years of fear. But she had felt that tremor in his hand. She had seen the way he looked at her when he thought the world wasn't watching. Tomorrow was his birthday, and if he wouldn't let her bring the light to him, she would have to find a way to make him step into it himself. She picked up her quill and began to write, not a list, but a letter. A letter she knew she might never send, but one that contained the truth she was too afraid to say out loud, that she didn't just want him to be happy. She wanted to be the reason why. Outside, the rain began to fall in earnest, a steady, rhythmic drumming against the castle walls. It was the sound of time running out. Hermione leaned her head against the cool glass of the window, the image of Draco's thumb against her skin haunting her vision. The tension between "can't stand it" and "can't help but think" had finally tipped. The birthday was coming, and with it, a storm that would either wash away the past or bury them both beneath it. The morning of June 5th dawned not with the golden clarity of summer, but with a thick, suffocating mist that clung to the great hall like a damp shroud. Hermione sat at the Gryffindor table, her tea going cold as she watched the owls descend. Her heart performed a nervous staccato against her ribs every time a tawny or barn owl veered toward the Slytherin table. Draco was already there. He sat at the very edge of his bench, surrounded by an intentional vacuum of space. He looked worse than he had the night before. His skin possessed a translucent, waxen quality, and the shadows beneath his eyes were so dark they looked like bruises. He wasn't eating. He was staring at a singular, official-looking envelope that had just been dropped in front of him. It bore the heavy, ostentatious wax seal of the Malfoy estate. Hermione watched his throat move as he swallowed hard. His fingers hovered over the parchment, trembling with a frequency that made her want to reach across the hall and steady them. This was the cold she had anticipated, the weight of a legacy that felt more like a shackle than a gift. When Draco finally broke the seal, his face didn't change, but his knuckles went so white they looked like polished bone. He read the letter twice, then slowly, methodically, tore it into 16 perfect squares. He didn't drop them on the table. He tucked them into his pocket as if hiding evidence of a crime. "You're doing it again," Ron muttered beside her, his mouth full of toast. The Malfoy watch. Give it a rest, Hermione. It's just another year for him to be a prat. It's his 20th birthday, Ron, she said, her voice tight. And he just received a letter that made him look like he's about to faint. Probably his mother reminding him to polish the family silver, Harry added, though his tone was less biting, more weary. Let him be, Hermione. You can't save everyone. But Hermione wasn't listening. She saw Draco rise, his movements stiff and brittle. He didn't look toward the Gryffindor table. He walked out of the hall with his head down, his shoulders hunched as if bracing for an impact that was already happening. She gave him a 5-minute lead before she followed. She found him in the corridor leading to the herbology glasshouses. The air here was warmer, smelling of damp earth and fertilizer. Draco was leaning against a stone pillar, his eyes closed, his forehead pressed against the cool masonry. In the morning light, he looked agonizingly young and terrifyingly old all at once. "Go away, Granger," he said, without opening his eyes. "I brought you something," she said, stepping into the light. She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, clumsily wrapped package. It wasn't the traditional gift she had planned. It was a simple, leather-bound notebook, blank, heavy with high-quality parchment, and charmed to be fireproof. Draco opened his eyes. The grey was clouded, turbulent. He looked at the gift as if it were a venomous creature. "I don't want your charity." "It's not charity. It's a place for the things you can't say out loud," she replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her knees. "I saw you tear up that letter. I know what it's like to have words you need to destroy." The tension in the corridor spiked. Draco straightened up, his height suddenly imposing. He took a step toward her, the atmospheric pressure between them thickening until it felt like walking through water. "You know nothing. You think, because you've read a few books on trauma and spent a year being the golden girl, that you can diagnose me. My father is in a cell, my mother is a shell, and I am a walking ghost. I don't need a notebook, Granger. I need to be left alone." "Then why did you touch me last night?" The question hung in the air, a sharp, jagged truth that sliced through his defenses. Draco flinched as if she had struck him. The memory of his thumb against her skin, that brief electric moment of warmth, seemed to burn between them now. "A mistake," he spat, though his eyes betrayed him. They were fixed on her mouth, a hunger there that he couldn't quite mask with his disdain. "A momentary lapse in judgment caused by the fumes of your poorly brewed potion." "Liar," she whispered. She moved closer, defying the repulsion he was trying to project. She could see the pulse jumping in his neck. She reached out and pressed the gift into his chest. For a moment, their fingers tangled over the leather, his cold and stiff, hers warm and insistent. "Happy birthday, Draco," she said, her voice dropping to a sensual, private murmur. For a heartbeat, the warmth returned. His hand closed over hers, not to push her away, but to hold her there. The tactile friction was overwhelming, the bite of a silver ring on his finger pressed against her knuckle. His gaze softened, the ice melting into something dark and desperate. He leaned down, his breath fanning over her face, smelling of mint and the sharp ozone of his magic. But then, the sound of laughter erupted from the nearby courtyard. A group of Hufflepuffs wandered past the glass house, their cheerful chatter a violent intrusion on their private bubble. The betrayal of the world outside was too much. Draco's face hardened instantly. He snatched the notebook from her hand and shoved it into his bag. "Don't ever do that again," he hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and shame. "Don't touch me. Don't look at me like I'm something worth saving. You're just a girl who loves a lost cause, and I am the most lost cause of them all." He turned and bolted toward the greenhouses, the heavy oak doors slamming shut behind him with a finality that echoed through the stone corridor. Hermione stood alone, her hand still tingling from where he had held it. The cold had returned, more bitter than before. She felt a wave of doubt wash over her. Perhaps Ron was right. Perhaps she was just chasing a shadow that wanted to stay in the dark. But then she looked down. There, on the floor where he had been standing, was a single, small scrap of the letter he had torn up. She picked it up. On the parchment, in Lucius Malfoy's sharp, unforgiving script, were 3 words: "Restore the name." A wave of nausea hit her. It wasn't a birthday letter. It was a command. A demand for him to return to the very thing that had broken him. The conflict intensified within her. She realized then that Draco wasn't just fighting her. He was fighting a tidal wave of expectation that threatened to pull him under. His repulsion wasn't hatred. It was fear. He was afraid that if he let her in, he would lose the strength he needed to survive his own family. She didn't follow him into the greenhouse. Instead, she turned back toward the castle. Her mind was no longer on cake or streamers. It was on the way his hand had felt when he thought no one was looking. The desperate, crushing grip of a man who was falling and had finally found something to hold on to. She had 12 hours left of his birthday. The seesaw was in motion, swinging wildly between the heat of their contact and the frost of his fear. "You want to be a ghost, Draco?" she whispered to the empty corridor. "Fine, but I've always been quite good at seeing things that aren't there." She began to walk, her pace quickening. She had a new plan. It didn't involve the library or the Great Hall. It involved the one place where the stars felt close enough to touch and the world felt small enough to ignore. The astronomy tower. As she hurried away, she failed to notice Draco watching her from behind the glass of Greenhouse 3. He was holding the notebook she had given him, his thumb tracing the texture of the leather. He looked utterly conflicted, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the gift, torn between the impulse to throw it into the compost and the overwhelming, terrifying urge to open it and write her name on the first page. The storm was building, the atmospheric pressure rising until the very stones of Hogwarts seemed to hum with the coming change. The heat of the afternoon had become a physical weight, a suffocating blanket of humidity that made the stones of the castle feel as though they were perspiring. Hermione bypassed the Great Hall for lunch, her stomach too tightly knotted for food. Instead, she found herself drawn to the herbology wing, guided by a strange magnetic pull she no longer cared to rationalize. She found him in the shadows of the rear greenhouse, a place usually reserved for the more temperamental specimens of the magical flora. Draco was sitting on a low stone wall, surrounded by the lush, overhanging vines of venomous tentacula, which, uncharacteristically, seemed to be recoiling from the sheer intensity of his silence. He was staring at the leather-bound notebook she had given him. He hadn't opened it yet, but he was holding it with a possessive, almost desperate grip. "They'll bite if you sit there too long," she said softly, her voice barely a ripple in the humid air. Draco didn't flinch. He didn't even turn his head. "They wouldn't dare. Even plants have a sense for what's toxic, Granger. They know a lost cause when they see one." Hermione stepped into the greenhouse, the scent of damp earth and crushed mint instantly coating her senses. The atmosphere was thick, charged with the static of unspoken words. "You're not toxic, Draco. You're just exhausted. There's a difference." "Is there?" He finally looked at her, his grey eyes shards of ice in the verdant light. "My father thinks I'm a vessel for a name that's been dragged through the mud. My classmates think I'm a coward who hid behind a mask. And you? You think I'm a puzzle you can solve by being kind. All of you are wrong. I'm just nothing." The cold in his voice was a defense, a wall of frost meant to keep the world at bay. But Hermione saw the way his fingers trembled as they traced the grain of the leather. She moved closer, the distance between them shrinking until she could see the silver glint of the sweat on his brow. "I don't think you're a puzzle," she whispered, her voice low and steady. "I think you're someone who has forgotten what it feels like to be seen without being judged." She reached out, her hand hovering over his. For a moment, the friction was almost audible, the clash of her warmth against his icy resolve. Draco let out a shaky breath, his gaze dropping to her hand. "Don't," he warned, though the word lacked any real conviction. It was the plea of a man who wanted to be saved, but was afraid of the cost. Hermione ignored the warning. She pressed her palm over his hand, pinning it to the leather of the notebook. The contact was visceral. His skin was burning, a sharp contrast to the cool dampness of the greenhouse. Draco didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers curled upward, tentatively catching hers. It was a warmth so sudden and intense it made her heart skip a beat. "Why are you still here?" he asked, his voice cracking. "I've given you every reason to walk away. I've insulted you. I've pushed you. I've been a Malfoy." "Because it's your birthday," she said, stepping into his personal space, her knees brushing against his. "And because I've spent 7 years watching you hide. I'd like to see you, just for once." The tension shifted, the repulsion of his fear giving way to a magnetic, tactile pull. Draco stood up, his height forcing her to tilt her head back. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest, the scent of ozone and peppermint now overwhelming. His eyes searched hers, looking for a lie, a trick, a mockery, but finding only a devastating, honest vulnerability. His hand left the notebook and rose to her face, his fingers grazing her jawline. The touch was hesitant, a question asked in the dark. Hermione leaned into it, her breath hitching as his thumb traced the curve of her lower lip. The silence of the greenhouse was no longer empty. It was filled with the rhythmic drumming of 2 hearts trying to find a shared tempo. "You're mad," he breathed, his face descending toward hers. "Completely and utterly mental." "Probably," she whispered, just as the world seemed to narrow down to the space between their lips. The heavy oak doors of the greenhouse creaked open. Neville Longbottom walked in, arms full of dragon dung fertilizer, humming a cheerful tune that died instantly as he saw the 2 figures silhouetted against the vines. "Oh, sorry, I just need the fertilizer," Neville stammered, his face turning a shade of red that rivaled a ripe pomegranate. The spell shattered. Draco jerked back as if hit by a stupefied charm. The cold returned with a vengeance, his expression hardening into a mask of aristocratic disdain that was so sharp it felt like a physical blow. "Granger was just advising me on the toxicity of the tentacula," Draco said, his voice flat and lifeless. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. "Right. Yes. Expert advice," Hermione managed to say, her fingers frantically straightening her cuffs, her skin still humming from his touch. Draco turned on his heel and walked out without another word, his cloak billowing behind him. He left the notebook on the stone wall, forgotten or discarded. She couldn't tell. Hermione picked it up, the leather still warm from his grip. The betrayal of the moment felt like a weight in her chest. Every time they drew close, the world intervened, or his own fear pushed him back into the shadows. It was a cycle of approach and repulsion that was wearing her down, making her doubt her own instincts. She looked at Neville, who was awkwardly avoiding her gaze. "It's fine, Neville. Just a difficult conversation." She walked out into the sweltering afternoon, the notebook clutched to her chest like a shield. The warmth of his touch was fading, replaced by a biting uncertainty. Was she just forcing this? Was he right? Was he a lost cause? She spent the next few hours in the library, though she didn't read a single word. She watched the sun begin its slow descent, the sky turning a bruised, violent orange. The heat didn't break. If anything, it became more oppressive, a precursor to the storm she knew was coming. As the clock struck 6, Hermione made a decision. She wouldn't let the day end in retreat. She would meet him at the one place where there were no walls, no greenhouses, and no Neville Longbottoms. She took a piece of parchment and wrote a single line: "The Astronomy Tower. Midnight. Don't let the day end in the dark." She folded it and charmed it to find him. As she watched the paper crane fly out of the window, she felt a sudden, sharp tremor in her hands. This was it, the final warmth, or the ultimate cold. She went to her dormitory and changed into a lighter dress, her fingers fumbling with the buttons. She caught her reflection in the mirror. Her eyes were wide, her cheeks flushed. She looked like a girl on the verge of a cliff, uncertain if she was about to fall or fly. The castle was quiet now, the students retreating to their common rooms to escape the heat. Hermione walked the silent corridors, her footsteps echoing with a hollow, rhythmic thud. Each step toward the astronomy tower felt like a step away from her old self, the girl who followed rules, the girl who lived by the book. She reached the spiral staircase, the air cooling slightly as she ascended. The scent of ozone was stronger here, the magic of the tower humming in the stones. She stepped out onto the balcony, the wind whipping her hair across her face. The sky was black, the stars hidden by a thick blanket of clouds. In the distance, a flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, followed seconds later by the low, guttural growl of thunder. She was alone, her heart light. The repulsion had won. He hadn't come. She leaned against the cold stone railing, the first drop of rain hitting her cheek, a cold, sharp reminder of her own foolishness. "You're late, Granger." The voice came from the shadows, low and rasping. Hermione spun around, her breath catching in her throat. Draco was leaning against the opposite wall, his white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, his hair a mess of pale silk in the wind. He looked like a man standing in the middle of a wreck, unsure of what to save. The tension in the tower was electric, the atmospheric pressure so high it felt like the very air was about to ignite. The warmth returned, fiercer than ever, as they stood in the silence, the rain beginning to fall around them like a curtain of silver. The birthday wasn't over. The storm had just begun. The storm did not break. It simmered. On the highest balcony of the astronomy tower, the air was a thick electric soup of humidity and impending rain. The distant flashes of lightning over the forbidden forest provided the only illumination, casting Draco's silhouette in jarring, strobe-like intervals. He looked like a statue that had only recently learned how to breathe, stiff, pale, and remarkably fragile against the backdrop of the churning sky. I didn't think you'd come, Hermione said, her voice barely carrying over the rising wind. She stayed near the entrance of the staircase, her fingers curling around the cold iron railing. Draco stepped out of the shadows. The white of his shirt was stark against the gloom, the top buttons undone as if he was suffocating. I didn't intend to. I was halfway to the dungeons when your ridiculous paper bird hit me in the eye. You have a very aggressive charm work, Granger. Despite the insult, he didn't move away. He walked toward the edge of the parapet, his movements possessing a jagged, restless energy. The cold he usually projected was flickering, failing him in the face of the atmosphere's heavy pressure. "Why here?" he asked, gesturing to the empty space around them. "Of all the places in this cursed castle, why the one spot where everything fell apart?" "Because it's the highest point," she replied, moving closer until she was standing a few feet away from him. "Because from here, you can see that the world is bigger than Malfoy Manor or the Great Hall. And because—" She hesitated, her heart performing a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Here. No one can hear us." Draco turned to look at her. A flash of lightning washed out the color of the world, leaving his eyes two silver voids of raw, unfiltered pain. "And what exactly is it that needs to be said in such isolation? Are you going to give me another lecture on my potential? Or perhaps a colorful chart on how to rebuild a reputation from the ashes?" "I'm not here to talk about your reputation, Draco. I'm here because today is almost over, and you haven't had a single moment of peace." She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out a small, palm-sized wooden box. With a flick of her wand, the lid opened to reveal a single, flickering candle sitting atop a tiny, dense chocolate tart. The flame was enchanted to resist the wind, a stubborn little spark of gold in the oppressive dark. "It's not a feast," she whispered, her voice softening into something intimate and vulnerable. "It's just a tart, but it's yours, and it's not from the ministry, or your father, or the school. It's from me." The silence that followed was visceral. The warmth of the tiny flames seemed to radiate between them, a microscopic sun in a universe of shadows. Draco stared at the tart, his throat working as he swallowed. His face, usually a mask of aristocratic boredom, crumbled. For a terrifying second, she thought he might cry, but he instead let out a breath that sounded like a sob caught in a throat of glass. "You are infuriating," he rasped, stepping into her space. The magnetic pull was back, stronger than it had been in the greenhouse, fueled by the isolation and the height. "You find the one thing I'm trying to bury, and you dig it up with a spoon." "I'm not digging anything up. I'm just acknowledging that you're here, that you survived." He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the box. His fingers brushed against hers, tactile friction that felt like an interference of two different worlds. The heat of his skin was a jarring impact against the cool night air. Instead of taking the tart, he closed his hand around hers, his grip tight, almost desperate. "I don't deserve this," he whispered, his face inches from hers. "I don't deserve you standing here, looking at me as if I'm something more than a stain on the floor." "Stop," she commanded, her own voice trembling. "Stop deciding what you deserve. Just for tonight, let someone else decide." The tension reached a breaking point. The approach had been slow, agonizingly cautious, but the warmth was now an all-consuming fire. Draco's other hand rose, his long fingers tangling in the damp curls at the nape of her neck. He pulled her closer, his forehead resting against hers. The scent of him, ozone, rain, and that sharp, clean peppermint filled her lungs, making her lightheaded. "I've spent months trying to hate you, Granger," he murmured against her skin. "I've spent every waking hour reminding myself of who you are and who I am. I built walls. I laid traps. And you just walked through them like they weren't there. I'm very good at unlocking things," she whispered, her hands finding the lapels of his shirt. He let out a low, guttural groan, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a frantic, messy sort of worship. The "can't stand it" had finally been eclipsed by the "can't help but think." He looked at her mouth with such a raw, starving intensity that Hermione felt her knees weaken. But then the storm finally broke. A deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the tower, followed immediately by a literal wall of rain. It didn't start with drops. It started with a deluge. Within seconds, they were both drenched, the water plastering Hermione's dress to her skin and Draco's hair to his forehead. The sudden, violent cold of the rain should have pushed them apart, but it did the opposite. It acted as a catalyst, stripping away the last of their pretenses. Draco's grip tightened. "You're going to catch your death," he shouted over the roar of the downpour, but he didn't let go. "It's just water," she laughed, a wild, breathless sound that was unlike her. He looked at her then, really looked at her, and the conflict in his eyes finally settled into a singular, devastating realization. The betrayal of his own logic was complete. He didn't care about the name, or the notebook, or the letter in his pocket. He only cared about the girl in his arms who was looking at him as if he were the center of the world. He leaned in, his lips a fraction of an inch from hers, the atmospheric pressure between them so high it felt like the air itself was glowing. "Hermione," he breathed, the first time he had ever used her name. She reached up, her fingers digging into his shoulders, drawing him down. But just as their lips were about to meet, a brilliant silver light erupted from the staircase. "Expecto Patronum!" A giant, translucent lynx bounded onto the balcony, its silver light blinding in the darkness. It paced around them, its presence radiating a cold, protective magic that felt like a bucket of ice water over their heads. "Malfoy! Granger! Are you up there?" Kingsley Shacklebolt's voice boomed from the stairs, distorted by the wind, but unmistakably authoritative. "The wards have been tripped. We have a security breach in the lower levels." The repulsion was instantaneous. Draco shoved himself away from her, his face turning a ghostly, sickly white. The guilt and the fear that he had momentarily forgotten came rushing back, a tidal wave of cold that made him look like he had been struck. "Go," he hissed, his voice a frantic rasp. "Get out of here. If they find us together, if they think I'm involved in whatever is happening." "Draco, no! It's just a security check. Go!" he roared, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his wand. "You want to help me? Then don't be seen with me. Stay on your side of the line, Hermione." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned and vanished into the darkness of the inner tower, leaving her standing alone in the freezing rain. The little tart she had brought lay on the floor, the candle extinguished, the chocolate turning to a soggy mess under the relentless downpour. The warmth was gone. The trust had been shattered by the first sign of external pressure. Hermione stood in the silver light of the links, her heart feeling like it had been physically bruised. She had reached for him, and for a second he had reached back. But the ghosts of his past were still stronger than the hope of his future. She began to descend the stairs, her footsteps heavy and hollow. The birthday wasn't over yet, but the celebration was dead. Or so she thought, as she wiped the rain and the silent, salt-heavy tears from her face. The internal corridors of the castle felt like the throat of a great stone beast, cold, damp, and smelling of ancient enchantments. Hermione hurried toward the Gryffindor Tower, her boots squelching with every step, the hem of her dress leaving a trail of rainwater like a morning shroud. The warmth of the tower was a fading memory, replaced by a cold so absolute it felt as though the Dementors had returned to the grounds. She reached the portrait hole, her teeth chattering. The fat lady looked at her with uncharacteristic pity. "A bit late for a stroll in the rain, isn't it, dear?" "Just let me in," Hermione whispered, her voice cracking. Inside, the common room was empty, save for the dying embers in the hearth. She didn't go to her bed. She sat on the rug, much like she had the night before, staring at the orange glow. Her mind was a chaotic loop of Draco's face, the way he had looked when he said her name, and the way he had looked when he pushed her away. Approach, repulsion, warmth, cold. The cycle was exhausting. She felt a profound sense of betrayal, not from Draco, but from the universe itself. Every time the magnetic pull became undeniable, something, a person, a storm, a war, intervened to remind them of the chasm between them. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the scrap of Lucius's letter. Restore the name. It wasn't just a command, it was a curse. Draco wasn't just afraid of the ministry or the guards. He was afraid of himself. He was afraid that by loving her, he would finally destroy the only thing he had left. His identity as a Malfoy, however tattered that identity might be. Suddenly, the portrait hole swung open. Hermione jumped, her hand flying to her wand. But it wasn't a guard. It was a house elf she didn't recognize, wearing a clean pressed tea towel with the Hogwarts crest. "Miss Granger," the elf squeaked, bowing so low its nose brushed the floor. "Master Draco is asking for you. He is being very loud." In the prefect's bathroom. Hermione frowned. The prefect's bathroom? What is he doing there? "He is breaking things, miss, and he is saying your name. The other prefects is being scared to go in." A surge of adrenaline replaced the chill in her bones. She didn't think about the rules, the curfew, or the security breach. She stood up, her damp clothes clinging to her, and ran. The corridors were silent, the silver light of the moon occasionally breaking through the clouds to illuminate the suits of armor. She reached the 4th floor, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The door to the prefect's bathroom was slightly ajar, and the sound of crashing porcelain echoed into the hallway. She pushed the door open. The room was filled with a thick, floral-scented steam. The great gold tap was running, pouring gallons of multicolored bubbles into the massive swimming pool-sized tub. But Draco wasn't in the water. He was standing by the sinks, his knuckles bleeding where he had struck the mirror. The glass was webbed with cracks, a silver spiderweb reflecting his distorted, fractured face. He had the notebook she had given him in his hand, and for a moment she thought he was going to throw it into the water. "Draco, stop!" she cried out. He spun around, his eyes wild, his white shirt now soaked and translucent against his skin. The tension in the room was suffocating, the atmospheric pressure of his grief pressing against her lungs. "I told you to stay away," he roared, but his voice broke at the end. He looked like a man who had reached the absolute edge of his endurance. "Why can't you just let me rot in peace? Why do you have to keep coming back?" "Because you called for me," she said, stepping into the steam. The heat of the room was a jarring impact after the cold rain. "The elf said you were calling my name." Draco froze. He looked down at his bloodied knuckles, then at the notebook. He let out a jagged, hollow laugh. "I didn't call you. I was talking to the wall. I was telling the wall how much I hate that you've ruined everything." "I haven't ruined anything." "You have!" He stepped toward her, the distance between them closing with a visceral alignment. He grabbed her shoulders, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "I had a plan, Hermione. I was going to be the invisible man. I was going to pay my debts, restore the name, and live a life of quiet, miserable dignity. And then you started looking at me. You started giving me blank books and chocolate tarts, and you looked at me like I wasn't a monster." "You aren't a monster," she whispered, her hands rising to touch his chest, feeling the frantic, galloping beat of his heart. "I am," he shouted, his face inches from hers. "I'm a Malfoy. I'm the boy who had no choice. And if I touch you, really touch you, I lose everything I've used to keep myself together. I can't be both. I can't be his son and your... whatever this is." The conflict was laid bare, a raw, bleeding wound between them. Hermione didn't pull away from his grip. She leaned in, her forehead pressing against his. The scent of the floral bubbles mingled with the ozone of his skin, creating a heady, intoxicating atmosphere. "You don't have to be his son," she murmured. "It's your birthday, Draco. Choose who you want to be. Just for the next 5 minutes. Choose." The trust hung in the air, a fragile thread. Draco's grip on her shoulders softened. His hands slid down her arms, his fingers grazing the damp fabric of her dress. The warmth returned, not as a spark this time, but as a steady, rising heat. He looked at her, the grey of his eyes finally clearing, and the turbulent clouds settling into a deep, dark silver. He saw the girl who had fought for him when no one else would. He saw the girl who had waited in the rain. "I don't know how," he whispered. "I'll show you," she replied. She reached up, her fingers digging into the hair at the nape of his neck, and pulled him down. This time there was no lightning, no Patronus, no interruption. The kiss was a jarring impact of two souls that had been starving for years. It wasn't gentle. It was a desperate, tactile friction of teeth and lips and tongues. It tasted of salt, rain, and the floral sweetness of the steam. It was the final shift she had been waiting for, the moment where the "can't stand it" became a "can't breathe without." Draco let out a sound, a low, broken hum of relief as he pulled her flush against him. The water from the tub continued to overflow, the bubbles spilling onto the marble floor, but neither of them noticed. The world had narrowed down to the heat of their bodies and the frantic, rhythmic interference of their breath. He pulled back for a second, his eyes searching hers, his face transformed by a raw, terrifyingly beautiful vulnerability. "Hermione," he breathed. the name a prayer. But even as the warmth consumed them, a shadow of doubt remained. Draco's eyes flickered to the door. The security breach was still unresolved. The world outside the steam-filled room was still waiting to judge them. "We have to go," he whispered, though he didn't move an inch. "If they find us here." "Let them find us," she said, her voice filled with a fierce Gryffindor defiance. But Draco shook his head. He stepped back, the cold returning just enough to make him reach for his wand. He looked at the broken mirror, then at the overflowing tub. He performed a quick, silent charm, and the water began to recede. The mess was cleaned, the evidence of his breakdown erased. "Not like this," he said, his voice regaining its aristocratic restraint, though his eyes remained soft. "I won't have you dragged down because of me, not on my birthday." He picked up the notebook from the floor. He handed it to her, his fingers lingering on hers for a long, agonizing second. "Keep it for me. Until I can write something worthy of you in it." The repulsion this time wasn't out of hate. It was an act of protection. But as he turned to leave through the secret passage behind the tapestry, he stopped. He looked back at her, the moonlight from the high window catching the silver of his hair. "It was the best gift I've ever received, Hermione. All of it." He vanished into the shadows, leaving her standing in the cooling steam. The birthday was coming to an end, the clock ticking toward midnight. She looked down at the notebook in her hands. The resolution wasn't complete, but the conflict had changed. They were no longer enemies. They were something much more dangerous. Two people with something to lose. The midnight bell of the clock tower began its heavy, rhythmic tolling, just as Hermione stepped back into the corridor. Each strike felt like a physical vibration in the floorboards, marking the transition from the frantic heat of June 5th to the uncertain silence of the 6th. The warmth of the bathroom, the taste of salt and peppermint still lingering on her lips, felt like a dream that was already beginning to fray at the edges. She moved through the shadows with a newfound stealth, the notebook tucked beneath her arm like a talisman. The castle was different now. The atmospheric pressure had shifted. The storm had passed, leaving behind a heavy, humid stillness that made the air feel thick with secrets. She reached the tapestry of Barnabas the Balmy, the entrance to the corridor that led toward the Gryffindor Tower, but her feet hesitated. The doubt she had felt in the steam was growing. Draco had chosen to protect her, to push her away to save her from his own wreckage. It was a noble gesture, perhaps the first truly selfless act she had seen from him, but it felt like a hollow victory. She didn't want to be protected. She wanted to be chosen. As she rounded the corner near the Great Hall, she saw a flicker of light. She ducked behind a suit of armor, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against the metal. It wasn't a guard. It was Draco. He was standing in the center of the hall, the massive oak doors slightly ajar behind him. He wasn't hiding anymore. He was standing in a pool of moonlight that turned his hair into a halo of cold silver. He held his wand at his side, the tip glowing with a faint, steady light. Opposite him stood a figure cloaked in the deep crimson of the Ministry's aura department. "I told you, Dawlish," Draco's voice rang out, devoid of its usual tremor. It was the voice of a Malfoy, cold and resonant, yet there was a new, jagged edge of defiance in it. "I was in the library, then I was in the bathroom. If your wards are so sensitive they react to a student's insomnia, perhaps you should recalibrate them. Your father's associates don't have insomnia, Malfoy. The aura growled, his hand hovering near his own wand. They have agendas. We know there was a signal sent from the tower. Then find the sender, Draco replied, stepping forward until he was mere inches from the aura's face. The tactile friction of the moment was palpable, even from Hermione's hiding place. But do not touch me, and do not speak of my father as if I am his shadow. I am Draco Malfoy, and I am tired of being your convenient suspect. The conflict here was no longer between two students. It was the visceral alignment of a man breaking his own chains. Hermione watched, her breath hitched in her throat as Draco stared the aura down. For the first time, he didn't look broken. He looked dangerous, not with the malice of the dark mark, but with the power of someone who had finally found something worth defending. The Auror eventually grunted and stepped back, the silver light of Draco's presence apparently too much to contest in the dead of night. Go to your dorm. If I see you out again, it's a cell in the ministry, birthday or not. Draco didn't move until the aura's footsteps had faded into the distance. Only then did his shoulders sag. He leaned against the wall, his head dropping back against the stone. Hermione stepped out from the shadows. The sound of her boots on the stone was soft, but he heard it. He didn't reach for his wand. He didn't even open his eyes. "You're still here," he whispered. "I couldn't just leave," she said, crossing the distance. The warmth returned as she stood before him, the magnetic pull between them overriding the fear of the guards. That was brave. Draco opened his eyes. They were exhausted, but the turbulent grey had been replaced by a quiet, steady light. "It wasn't brave, Hermione. It was necessary. I spent 20 years letting other people tell me who I was. My father, the Dark Lord, even you in your own way. Tonight, I decided I didn't like any of the versions I was being offered." He looked at the notebook under her arm. "You kept it." "Of course I kept it." She reached out, her fingers grazing the back of his hand. The contact was electric, a sharp reminder of the kiss in the steam. "You said you wanted to write something worthy of me in it. I'm holding you to that." The tension shifted from "can't stand it" to a profound, quiet trust. The seesaw had finally leveled. Draco took the notebook from her, his fingers lingering on hers. This time, when he pulled her closer, it wasn't with the desperation of a drowning man. It was with the steady, purposeful intent of someone who had finally found land. "He was right about one thing," Draco murmured, his breath fanning her cheek. "The signal from the tower. It wasn't a dark mark. It was me. I sent a message to my mother. I told her I wasn't coming home this summer. I told her I was staying here to finish what I started." "And what did you start?" she asked, her voice a low, sensual vibration. Draco looked down at her, his thumb tracing the curve of her lip, the skin-on-skin contact making the rest of the world fall away. "I started to believe that I might be more than my name, and I started to believe that you might be the reason why." The approach was over. They were finally in the same space, physically and emotionally. The betrayal of their backgrounds had been replaced by a visceral alignment of their futures. He leaned down, and this kiss was different. It wasn't a collision of teeth and desperation. It was slow, imaginative, and deeply emotional. It tasted of the rain that had dried on their skin and the hope that was just beginning to bloom. It was a promise made in the dark of the Great Hall, a resolution to the conflict that had defined their lives for 7 years. But as they pulled apart, a new cold settled over them. Not the cold of fear, but the cold of reality. The sun would be up in a few hours. The war was over, but the rebuilding had just begun. "We can't be seen like this tomorrow," Draco said, his voice regaining a hint of its restrained aristocratic weight. "Not yet. There are too many people who would want to tear this apart before it's even begun." "I know," Hermione said, her hand tightening on his sleeve. "But we have the notebook, and we have the towers, and we have the shadows." Draco smiled, a real, genuine smile that transformed his face, smoothing the lines of guilt and age. "And I have you, which is significantly more than I had at 19. He leaned in for one last lingering touch, his forehead resting against hers. The silence of the castle was no longer a weight. It was a sanctuary. The birthday was officially over, but as the first hint of grey light began to touch the high windows of the Great Hall, Hermione realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't looking for a plan. She was just looking at him. "Happy birthday, Draco," she whispered. "Go to bed, Granger," he replied, his voice thick with an affection he no longer tried to hide. "You have a lot of civic duty to perform tomorrow, and I expect you to be thorough." She turned to leave, but he caught her hand one last time. He didn't say anything, but the look in his eyes, the non-verbal intimacy of his gaze, said everything she needed to know. The "can't help but think" had become "can't help but love." Hermione walked back to her tower, her heart feeling lighter than the morning mist. She had set out to give him a day of celebration, but in the end, they had given each other something far more valuable: a beginning. As she climbed the stairs to the dormitory, she heard the faint, distant sound of a bird waking up. The storm was gone. The heat had broken. And as she closed her eyes, the last thing she felt was the bite of a silver ring against her skin, a tactile memory of the man who was no longer a ghost. The morning of June 6th arrived with a clarity that felt almost violent after the atmospheric pressure of the previous night. The sun rose over the Black Lake, piercing through the remnants of the storm clouds and painting the stone corridors of Hogwarts in shades of pale primrose and sharp gold. For Hermione, waking up felt like surfacing from a deep, turbulent ocean. Her skin still hummed with the phantom sensation of Draco's touch, and the scent of peppermint seemed to have woven itself into the very fabric of her pillow. She dressed slowly, her movements deliberate. The internal conflict that had driven her for weeks, the need to fix, to plan, to intervene, had quieted into a steady, glowing resolve. As she descended to the Great Hall, she noticed that the castle felt different. The shadows weren't as heavy. The air, finally cooled by the rain, carried the scent of wet earth and blooming lilies. The Great Hall was buzzing with the usual breakfast energy, but as Hermione stepped across the threshold, her eyes instinctively sought the far end of the Slytherin table. He was there. Draco was sitting upright, his spine a rigid line of aristocratic poise, but the cold mask was gone. He was engaged in a quiet conversation with Blaise Zabini, and though his face remained restrained, There was a new lightness in the way he held his head. He looked up as she approached the Gryffindor table. For a fraction of a second, the world narrowed down to the magnetic pull of their shared gaze. It was a look of profound, non-verbal intimacy, a silent acknowledgement of the final shift they had experienced in the shadows of the bathroom and the moonlight of the hall. He didn't wave. He didn't smile. He simply nodded, a slight, nearly imperceptible inclination of his head that felt more significant than 1,000 words. It was the warmth of a secret held between two people who had finally stopped fighting the inevitable. Hermione sat down beside Ginny, her fingers tracing the edge of her plate. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her cuffs, her heart performing a light, fluttering dance. "You look different," Ginny whispered, leaning in close. "Did something happen during Operation Malfoy?" "The project is complete," Hermione said, her voice steady. "The results were unexpected." Throughout the day, they existed in a state of choreographed distance. In ancient runes, they sat 3 desks apart, yet the atmospheric pressure between them was so high that Hermione could barely focus on the translation of the Perthrow rune. She could feel his eyes on the back of her neck. She could hear the rhythmic scratch of his quill, a sound that felt like a visceral alignment with her own thoughts. The seesaw had stopped moving. There was no more repulsion, only a tense, vibrating trust that required no outward display. As the sun began to set, casting long violet shadows across the grounds, Hermione found herself walking toward the lake. She didn't have a note this time. She didn't need one. She knew where he would be. She found him standing by the water's edge, near the spot where the giant squid occasionally broke the surface. He was holding the notebook she had given him. As she approached, the silence between them was not the awkward void of enemies, but the comfortable, imaginative silence of two people who had found their own language. "You haven't written in it yet," she observed, stepping onto the soft, damp grass beside him. Draco turned to her. In the fading light, the silver of his hair seemed to drink in the purple hues of the sky. He looked at her with a raw emotional intensity that made her breath hitch. "I told you, Granger. I'm waiting for the right words. Everything I start to write feels too small, too much like the old version of me." He reached out, his hand closing over hers. The tactile friction was immediate, the bite of his silver ring against her knuckle, the warmth of his palm against her skin. This was no longer a collision of two opposing forces. It was a homecoming. "I realized something today," Draco murmured, his voice dropping to that low, raspy tone that made her knees feel weak. "I spent my whole life being afraid of the dark, afraid of disappointing my father, afraid of the mark, afraid of the end. But the dark is just where you find the stars. You taught me that." He pulled her closer, his arm winding around her waist with a possessive, protective strength. Hermione leaned her head against his shoulder, the scent of ozone and clean linen enveloping her. The conflict of the 8th year, the broken prejudices and the fear of the future seemed to dissolve into the rhythmic lapping of the water against the shore. "It's not going to be easy, you know," she whispered into the lapel of his coat. "The world won't just let us be Draco and Hermione. They'll want the Death Eater and the war heroine." "Let them want," Draco replied, his chin resting atop her head. "I've had enough of living for what other people want. From now on, I'm living for the girl who brought me a chocolate tart in a thunderstorm." He stepped back just enough to look her in the eyes. The slow burn of the last few months had finally reached its peak, the flames steady and bright. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver fountain pen, a Malfoy heirloom no doubt. He opened the notebook to the very first page and, with a steady hand, wrote 3 words. He turned the book toward her. In elegant, sharp script, it read, "The first day." Hermione felt a surge of warmth that had nothing to do with the summer air. It was the resolution she had been searching for. Not a tidy ending, but a clear, beautiful beginning. "I think that's very worthy," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Draco closed the book and tucked it away. He then reached out, his fingers cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a lingering, sensual worship. The distance between them vanished for the final time. The kiss was the culmination of every doubt, every fear, and every unspoken hope of the last 24 hours. It was slow, deep, and tasted of the future. It was the sound of a name being restored, not through blood or legacy, but through the simple, devastating power of being loved. When they finally broke apart, the stars had begun to appear, reflected in the dark, still mirror of the lake. The atmospheric pressure had equalized. The tension had transformed into a tether. "Come on," Draco said, his hand remaining locked in hers. "If we're late for dinner, McGonagall will assume I've kidnapped you, and I'd really rather not spend the day after my birthday in a holding cell." "I'd testify in your defense," Hermione laughed, her eyes shining in the starlight. "You already have, Hermione," he said, his voice soft and sincere. "Every time you looked at me." They walked back toward the castle, 2 silhouettes against the ancient stone, their shadows intertwining on the path. The 8th solstice had passed, and with it, the ghosts of the past had finally been laid to rest. Draco Malfoy had turned 20, and in the span of a single day, he had stopped being a project and started being a man. And Hermione Granger, the girl who always had a plan, had finally found something that didn't need a list. A love that was as inevitable as the rising tide. The lights of the great hall beckoned, warm and inviting, but as they reached the heavy oak doors, they paused for one last second in the dark. "Happy birthday, Draco," she whispered one last time. He leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, his voice a promise that would hold long after the candles were blown out. "Thank you, Hermione, for everything." They stepped into the light together, the doors swinging shut behind them, leaving the shadows of the past exactly where they belonged, in the dark, beneath the stars. The week following Draco's birthday was characterized by a strange, shimmering sort of equilibrium. The castle, sensing the shift in the internal weather of its inhabitants, seemed to hold its breath. For the first time since the war ended, the atmospheric pressure in the hallways didn't feel like a prelude to a hex. It felt like the quiet hum of a clock that had finally been wound. Hermione sat in the window seat of the library, the afternoon sun casting long, honey-coloured rectangles across the floor. She held the notebook Draco had returned to her earlier that morning, her thumb tracing the grain of the leather. He had told her to open it when she was alone, and the weight of the request felt like a physical pressure against her chest. She turned the cover. She had expected prose, perhaps long, tortured apologies or academic observations on the nature of redemption. Instead, she found a visual diary of her own soul. The first few pages were filled with sketches, rendered in the sharp, precise lines of a silver point quill. There was a drawing of her, hunched over a book, a single stray curl escaping her bun like a question mark. There was a sketch of the astronomy tower under the storm, the lines jagged and visceral, capturing the raw interference of the elements. But it was the writing between the sketches that made her breath hitch. June 7th. The silence in the dungeons is no longer a vacuum. It is a space waiting to be filled. I looked at the Malfoy crest on my signet ring today and felt nothing but the weight of cold metal. Then I looked at her across the great hall, and the metal felt like it was melting. The warmth of his words radiated from the parchment, a tactile friction that made her skin tingle. He was doing it. He was writing himself into existence, peeling back the layers of aristocratic ice to reveal the broken but breathing man beneath. It's a work in progress, Granger. Don't go grading it yet. The voice was closer than she expected. Hermione looked up to see Draco standing at the end of the aisle. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear, the stormy grey replaced by a steady silver light. However, as he stepped into her personal space, she noticed the slight whitening of his knuckles as he gripped a rolled-up piece of parchment. "What is it?" she asked, the can't help but think instantly shifting into protective concern. "My mother is at the gates," he said, the words falling like stones into a still pond. "She's requested a formal audience with the headmistress, and she's requested that I be present, along with you." The tension in the air spiked, a sudden cold snap that made the sunny library feel cavernous and draughty. Hermione stood up, her fingers tightening around the notebook. This was the moment she had feared, the interference of the old world with the fragile new one they were building. "Me? Why me?" "Because she isn't a fool, Hermione. She's a black. She knows that my letters have changed. She knows the restoration of the name has been replaced by something she doesn't recognize." He moved closer, his hand finding hers. The contact was a visceral alignment, a grounding force in the rising storm of her anxiety. She wants to see what has diverted the course of the Malfoy stream. The walk to the headmistress's office was a study in non-verbal intimacy. They didn't speak, but their footsteps fell in a perfect rhythmic unison. The atmospheric pressure increased as they ascended the gargoyle stairs. Inside the office, the air smelled of lemon drops and old magic. Narcissa Malfoy was seated in a high-backed chair, her posture a masterpiece of pure-blood elegance. She wore a travelling cloak of deep charcoal silk, her pale hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to sharpen the angles of her face. She looked like a winter morning, beautiful, fragile, and utterly freezing. "Mother," Draco said, his voice regaining that restrained melodic weight. He didn't bow, but he inclined his head in a way that acknowledged her status while maintaining his own. "Draco," she replied, her gaze flicking to his hand, which was still firmly entwined with Hermione's. The silence that followed was a betrayal of every social grace Hermione had ever learned. Narcissa's eyes moved to Hermione, searching her face with a terrifying clinical intensity. It wasn't the look of a woman about to scream an insult. It was the look of an alchemist examining a new, unknown element. "Miss Granger," Narcissa said, her voice like the chime of a silver bell in a vacant corridor. I find myself in the unusual position of being in your debt. My son's birthday was significant. He wrote to me of a tart, a notebook, and a tower. He wrote with a clarity I haven't seen since he was 6 years old. Hermione felt the tension in the room shift. I only wanted him to have a choice, Mrs. I only wanted him to have a choice, Mrs. Malfoy, Hermione said, her voice steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. He spent too long being a vessel for other people's expectations. Narcissa stood up. The movement was fluid, ghostly. She walked toward them, the silk of her cloak whispering against the stone floor. She stopped inches from Hermione. The scent of expensive jasmine and cold rain enveloped them. Draco tensed beside her, his grip on her hand tightening until the bite of his ring was a sharp, comforting pain. Narcissa didn't look at her son. She looked at Hermione's eyes. She saw the fierce Gryffindor defiance and the deep, intelligent vulnerability. Then, in a move that shattered every broken prejudice Hermione had held about the Malfoy matriarch, Narcissa reached out. She didn't shake Hermione's hand. She placed her fingers, cold as marble, against Hermione's cheek for a fleeting, tactile second. It was an acknowledgement, a surrender, a passing of the torch. "The name is a heavy thing to carry, Miss Granger," Narcissa whispered, her eyes for a moment reflecting a hollow echo of her own lost youth. "If you are the one who helps him set it down, then perhaps the war is finally over." She turned back to Draco, her expression smoothing into its mask of ice. "Do not disappoint her, Draco. She has more to lose than you do." With a final, sharp nod to Professor McGonagall, who had been watching from the shadows with a look of profound curiosity, Narcissa Malfoy swept out of the room. The resolution of the scene left the office feeling strangely empty. Draco let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He turned to Hermione, his face transformed by a raw, devastatingly honest relief. "She didn't hex you," he murmured, a faint, lopsided smile touching his lips. "She touched my face, Draco. I think that's the pure-blood equivalent of a hug." He laughed, a real, vibrant sound that filled the room, chasing away the last of the cold. He pulled her into his arms, his face burying in the crook of her neck. The "can't help but think" had finally evolved into a "can't help but belong." "We're not ghosts anymore," he whispered against her skin. "No," she replied, her hands finding the small of his back, pulling him flush against her. "We're the ones who survived." As they left the office, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the grounds. Draco pulled the notebook from his pocket and a pen. On the page following the first day, he wrote a single line while they walked. June 12th. The foundations didn't rot. They were just waiting for a different kind of light. The conflict of the family legacy was not gone, but it was no longer a cage. As they descended toward the Great Hall, the atmospheric pressure was light, the air filled with the scent of the coming summer. They were no longer Draco and Hermione in secret. They were a visceral alignment of two worlds that had decided to stop colliding and start merging. The final shift was complete. The heat of mid-June had transformed Hogwarts into a kiln of golden stone and shimmering air. Inside the Great Hall, the usual long tables had been vanished, replaced by a sprawling floor of polished white marble that reflected the enchanted ceiling like a vast, starlit lake. The summer ball was not merely an end-of-term celebration. For the 8th years, it was a graduation from the ghosts of their past. Hermione stood at the entrance of the hall, her fingers frantically smoothing the silk of her dress, a deep, shimmering emerald that felt like a second skin. The atmospheric pressure of the room was stifling, thick with the scent of gardenias, expensive cologne, and the electric hum of 100 whispered conversations. Every time she breathed, she felt the tactile friction of the world's judgment pressing against her. "You're doing the sleeve thing again, Granger." The voice was a low melodic vibration right at her ear. Hermione turned to see Draco standing in the shadows of the doorway. He was dressed in charcoal dress robes of such fine wool they looked like smoke. The silver of his family crest was conspicuously absent, replaced by a simple, elegant pin of polished obsidian. He looked devastatingly sharp, his pale features softened by the warm glow of the floating candles. "I'm nervous," she admitted, her voice a small tremor in the cavernous space. "Everyone is looking, Draco. They're waiting for us to fail. They're waiting for the collision they've been promised for 7 years." Draco stepped out of the shadows, moving into her space with a visceral alignment that made the air around them feel charged. He didn't reach for her hand yet. Not here, not in the spotlight. But the non-verbal intimacy of his gaze was a tether, pulling her back from the ledge of her own anxiety. "Let them look," he murmured, his eyes searching hers with a raw emotional intensity. "They spent years watching us try to destroy each other. I think they can handle watching us try to be happy." He offered his arm, a formal, courtly gesture that felt like a declaration of war against the status quo. Hermione took it, the warmth of his wool sleeve beneath her fingers providing a grounding force. As they walked onto the marble floor, the sea of students parted. The silence was instantaneous, a sharp, jagged cold that rippled through the hall. She saw Ron at the edge of the floor, his face a complex map of confusion and reluctant acceptance. She saw Pansy Parkinson, her dark eyes narrowed in a look that was more curiosity than malice. The conflict was no longer private. It was a public spectacle, a seesaw of social expectations that threatened to tip at any moment. The orchestra began a slow, imaginative waltz, a melody that sounded like the pull of the moon on the tide. "Dance with me," Draco said. It wasn't a request, it was a promise. He led her to the center of the floor. As he placed his hand on the small of her back, the magnetic pull between them became the only thing that mattered. The tactile friction of his palm through the silk of her dress sent a jolt of electricity through her spine. They moved as one, a visceral alignment of two bodies that had finally found their shared rhythm. For the first few rotations, the room remained a blur of judgmental faces and hushed whispers. But as Draco spun her, his hand tightening slightly on hers, the internal monologue of her fear began to quiet. She looked up at him, at the sharp angle of his jaw, the silver light in his eyes, and the way his mouth was set in a line of quiet, stubborn defiance. "You're a very good dancer, Malfoy," she whispered, her voice a private secret between them. "My mother insisted on lessons from the age of 5, he replied, a ghostly smile touching his lips. "She said a Malfoy should always know how to lead, even when he has no idea where he's going. But for once, Hermione, I know exactly where I am." The tension in the room began to shift. The repulsion of the crowd was slowly being replaced by a reluctant, breathless awe. They weren't just dancing, they were rewriting the history of the castle. Every step was a resolution to a battle fought in the corridors. Every turn was a warmth that melted the ice of their reputations. Suddenly, Draco slowed his pace, drawing her even closer until her chest brushed against his. The atmospheric pressure of the moment was so high, it felt like the very air was glowing. "I have something for you," he whispered, his breath fanning her temple. "I was going to wait until the end of the night, but I think the world needs to see it now." He stopped in the middle of the floor, oblivious to the fact that they were now the sole focus of every eye in the hall. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside lay a delicate silver chain from which hung a single raw shard of transparent quartz. Not a Malfoy diamond, but a piece of the earth, clear and unyielding. "It's not a family heirloom," he said, his voice regaining that raw emotional vulnerability she had come to treasure. "It's a piece of the astronomy tower. I went back and found it after the storm. It's a reminder that even when things shatter, they can still catch the light." He turned her around, his fingers brushing the sensitive skin of her neck as he fastened the clasp. The cold bite of the silver against her skin was a grounding impact, a physical manifestation of his trust. When he turned her back to face him, the hall was no longer silent. A few people began to clap, softly at first, then with a rising rhythmic intensity. The betrayal of their roles as enemies was complete. "They're cheering," Hermione said, her eyes wide with disbelief. "They're cheering for the girl who didn't give up," Draco corrected, his voice thick with an affection he no longer cared to hide. "And for the man who finally figured out how to stay." He leaned down, and in front of the professors, the auras, and the ghosts of their former selves, he kissed her. It was a long, slow, and logical progression of the warmth they had built over the last week. It tasted of the summer air and the intoxicating freedom of no longer having to hide. The final shift was no longer just an internal experience. It was an atmospheric reality. As they broke the kiss, Hermione felt a profound sense of resolution. The conflict of the 8th year had been resolved, not through a victory of one side over the other, but through the creation of something entirely new. The ball continued, but for Draco and Hermione, the night was already over. They had faced the light, and for the first time in their lives, they hadn't burned. The scarlet steam of the Hogwarts Express billowed across platform 9 3/4, creating a liminal world of shifting grey mist and golden sunlight. It was the final day of the term, the air thick with the scent of coal smoke, damp wool, and the bittersweet tang of endings. For the first time in 7 years, the platform did not feel like a departure into a divided world. It felt like an arrival. Hermione stood near the center of the platform, her trunk settled beside her. She watched the chaos of families reuniting, the tearful embraces, the frantic owls, the laughter of younger students. But her focus was fixed on the far end of the train, where the mist was thickest. A figure emerged from the silver haze. Draco Malfoy moved with his usual grace, but the predatory, guarded edge of his stride had vanished. He was dressed in simple, dark travelling robes, carrying only a single leather satchel and the notebook she had given him. he didn't look for his mother. He didn't look for the remnants of his old circle. His grey eyes were locked onto hers with a magnetic pull that made the rest of the bustling crowd fade into a blurred background. As he reached her, the atmospheric pressure between them shifted. It was no longer a collision of opposing forces, but a visceral alignment of two souls who had survived the same wreckage. "The train leaves in 10 minutes, Granger," he said, his voice a low melodic rasp. "Are you still planning on following your schedule, or are you going to do something entirely illogical?" "My schedule involved a very detailed plan for a solitary summer of research," she replied, her fingers finding the lapel of his coat. The tactile friction of the wool against her skin was a grounding force. "But I find that my research is currently standing right in front of me." Draco let out a soft, jagged laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated relief. He reached out, his hand cupping her jaw. The bite of his silver ring against her skin was a familiar, comforting brand. "I talked to the goblins at Gringotts this morning. The manor is being shuttered. I've taken a small flat in a coastal village in France. It's quiet, it's far from the ministry, and the stars are supposedly quite visible." The warmth of his proposal was overwhelming. It was the ultimate resolution to the conflict of his heritage. He wasn't restoring a name, he was building a life. "France sounds academically interesting," Hermione whispered, her heart performing a frantic, rhythmic dance against her ribs. "It's not an academic trip, Hermione," he said, his face descending toward hers, his eyes dark with a raw emotional vulnerability. "It's a beginning, a real one. No ghosts, no marks, no expectations. Just us." The "can't stand it" had long since burned away, leaving behind a "can't breathe without" that was as essential as the air they shared. The tension of the platform, the eyes of the wizarding world still watching them from the periphery, didn't matter. The betrayal of their pasts was complete. He leaned in, and the kiss was slow, deep, and heavy with the weight of everything they had endured. It tasted of the peppermint he favoured, and the summer rain that had once washed them clean. It was a logical, beautiful progression of the slow burn that had started with a list in a dusty library and ended here, in the light of a new world. As they pulled apart, the whistle of the express pierced the air, a sharp, final call. "One more thing," Draco said, pulling the notebook from his satchel. He opened it to the very last page and handed it to her. Underneath the entries of their shared year, in a script that was no longer sharp and defensive, but flowing and open, he had written, "August 31st. We are no longer the victims of our history. We are the authors of our tomorrow. And tomorrow looks a lot like her." Hermione felt a tear escape, tracing a warm path down her cheek. She took the pen from his hand and, beneath his words, added a single defiant line. "The story starts now." They boarded the train together, not as a Gryffindor and a Slytherin, but as two people who had found the light in the middle of a storm. As the express lurched forward, pulling away from the platform and the ghosts of the war, Draco reached out and locked his hand in hers. The seesaw was gone. The repulsion was a memory. As the green hills of the Scottish Highlands began to roll past the window, reflecting in the silver depth of Draco's eyes, Hermione realized that the greatest magic wasn't found in a wand or a book. It was found in the silence of a shared gaze and the courage to touch the very person you were told to hate. The train sped toward the horizon, carries them away from the ruins of their childhood and toward the sun-drenched coast of a future they had earned. The conflict was resolved. The love was absolute. And for the first time in his life, Draco Malfoy didn't look back.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is special to me. It is not just about magic or wands, it is about two people who are lost, Draco and Hermione, living in a world of rules and old hate. But they choose something different. They choose to see each other. Love is not always a lightning bolt. Sometimes it is a slow fire. It starts with a look, a touch, a small gift on a lonely birthday. It is the courage to change your mind about someone. I hope this story reminded you of one thing. No matter how dark the past is, you can always write a new page. You're the author of your own tomorrow. If you enjoyed this journey, please let me know in the comments. Your support means the world to me. Until next time, keep looking at the stars.